Hello, and welcome to New Mexico Media Makers, where we put the focus on people who create film, television, new media, and jobs in the film and digital media industry. I'm your host, Mike Gaba, and here with me is my co-host, Catharine Pilafas. Today, we're very excited to be interviewing Grubb Graebner. He's the head of the Central New Mexico Community College Film Tech Department. Welcome.
Welcome, yes, fine.
Now, I feel obliged, of course, because your first name is really not Grubb, it's Jim.
Right.
So do tell. Grubb?
Yeah, it was a nickname I got in New York when I was working in theater. And it was easier for them to say a one-syllabic name than two syllables. So Graebner was too hard to say, so Grubb became my nickname. And in the business, once you get a nickname, that's how you get work, so I stuck with it.
Okay, good to know.
There are other reasons that are psychological, it has to do with my parents, but we don't need to reveal that on this program.
Nothing to do with witness protection or anything that we should be aware of?
No.
Okay.
I wouldn't tell you anyway for work.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, now back to business. So now, tell us about your career up to this point.
Dismal. No, actually,
it's getting better. You're here.
Yeah,
That's right.
no, I mean, the career, like anybody in the arts, is a very checkered thing. So I started off in theater, ended up going to LA because I was a playwright in New York and had my shows done there. I got an agent. Agent says, "You want to make some real money?" I said, "Yeah." Well, moved to LA and write movies. So I started doing that. Met some people there who ended up doing movies here. And then I was basically graduated from Los Alamos High School, but I returned to do movies in New Mexico when it looked like it was cheaper to do so. And so I returned and started doing movies, and then suddenly we had incentives which I helped promote through a digital filmmaking institute nonprofit that I had that did a festival. We wanted to bring people in, so we started working with John Hendry from 480 and the woman Nancy Everest, who was head of the film office at that time, and we put through some incentives, and then we had a Democratic governor, and so then he threw a lot of money in those incentives, and so I stayed just basically to train people to work on the movies that were going to be coming here because of our incentives.
So you've got your roots here now in New Mexico, without a
Yeah,
doubt.
I've had roots here. I'm a Chicago guy, but you know, I had to go to high school here. When I was late in grade school in the Bay Area, my parents moved to Los Alamos, and I thought it was punishment because it was a gated city, and yeah,
Right.
so.
Well, now tell us about this film course at CNM.
Well, it's basically training people to do the below-the-line jobs on a movie set. Crew, basically. So what happened was, we modeled it after a program in Florida by somebody named Ralph Clemente, unlike Rick Clemente, who you'll be talking to soon. But Ralph Clemente had a community college, Valencia Community College in Florida, where he trained people to work sound, grip, electric, all those below-the-line crafts, and then allowed people to come and produce with his students, and they would have less money to pay for the production because they use his equipment and his students. So we're going to model our program on his program because when the incentives came in 2003, part of the incentives was if you wanted a tax break or get some money on a loan program, you needed to employ 60% of the people from New Mexico. Right. So we didn't have enough people. We only had 240 people in Local 480, which is a below-the-line crew union. So what we did was we came up with a program to train people to bolster up the numbers that could get employed on movies, or else they couldn't get an incentive, or in this case, a loan. So we needed 60% of the people on the set working as crew. Well, that didn't happen. We had to, shade the truth a little bit because we never reached 60%, it would be 45, 43. What happened was we had to have an emergency training program, and that's when I came in to do it at TVI, at that time CNM now. And they needed somebody with some academic credentials who was also in the union, and so I stepped in to do just one term. I thought we would just kick it off, and then suddenly I'm still there.
Okay. So there's obviously a need for these kind of positions. And this is something that's training. Can they take this other places besides New Mexico as well?
Yeah, once you're in the union, you can go anywhere in the globe, basically. You go to a different union in LA or New York, and all they do is you have to raise your hand and say, "I'm from 480 in New Mexico, and you need to vote whether I can work in your state." And usually there's reciprocity, and we do that all the time. Some unions pay more for dues, so if you do work in a LA union or a New York union, you have to up your due payment, but they usually accept you. We had reciprocity with New Orleans, especially after the hurricane, because they didn't have any work there, so we allowed them to come and work in our union here, on movies here, because we were booming at that time, as a goodwill gesture. But we found out most of the people who were working on those movies were actually from Texas, so that's when we knew that Louisiana didn't have any crew either. Having crew is a big issue, because until recently, until 2004 and 5, most of the crew was in New York and LA. Right now in New Mexico, we have the third largest crew union in the U.S. behind LA, New York. So we actually have crewed up to about 1,200 people in Local 480.
Congratulations.
And so we worked real hard to get there. We still don't have enough, in my opinion. Our goal was to compete with Vancouver, which has 4,000 people working below the line jobs.
Wow.
That was our goal. We don't have that now because we don't have as many movies as we used to have. We're down a bit, but we still are trying to train people as quickly as possible. And it's tough too, because working with the union is, everybody knows the union mythology is nepotistic. They were very well guarded about their positions. They don't like letting new people in. So I'm kind of this upstart coming from the academic side saying, no, I got trained people. Oh, you're taking my job. So it's a tough balance.
Are you getting consistent interest and enrollment in your program at CNN?
Yeah, I get a lot of interest. People do want to work in the movies. Everybody on earth wants to work on the movies.
That's right.
They don't know how hard it is to work on the movies. So my program introduces them into the workforce, and they understand stamina, and they realize, oh, I love movies, but I don't have the stamina working a 14-hour day standing on my feet. So once they figure this isn't as fun as I thought, they go to above-the-line goals, like I want to be a screenwriter or a director or somebody who doesn't have to work really hard on the set. My skills that I teach are on-set skills, basically. And we branched out into post-production skills now because a lot of jobs are in post. A lot of editors are needed. A lot of digital CGI, a lot of effects are needed, and there is a growth in those jobs. Not necessarily New Mexico. Sony ImageWorks moved here to do their animation basic shop here. They took over the old AT&T building, but most of the people they brought in from England, Canada, California, Full Sail School from Florida. We didn't have enough people here that they wanted to hire. Even though we have programs in animation, they're not going to hire from our programs. And so it's really tough. My film crew program will hire people, I'll get them into the union, and then it's whether the movie wants to hire those people or not. But when it comes to animation and post, movies come here and they don't really hire anybody from our state in those areas. So it's an interesting flux here. So that's why we're promoting independent movies in New Mexico, because then people we train can do crew, post, and everything else. Does that make sense?
Sure. Now tell us, so within the industry, what do you see as the growth, the growth segment, as far as jobs and things like that? Should people be angling for? What would they look at as far as your program?
Well, my program, take the jobs that are hardest and people like the least. So, what's the hardest job on a movie set?
Caterer?
Well, caterer? Well, no, caterer, they're not actually in the union. We hire contract with the laborers like Mario's, but no.
So the grip?
Yeah.
Grip, people would say grips work really hard, and don't ever say a grip doesn't work hard because you might find yourself flying over a fence. But locations is probably the hardest job for me to get entry-level people in, and they don't realize how hard it is, but they like to get real new people do locations because you're working around the clock, and it's exhaustive, and you really need somebody young, and that's what I try to say. Oh, you want a job in the movies? Try locations.
Now see, that to me would seem kind of glamorous because you get to go out and find these different venues and stuff for what you're looking at. You're kind of on the road and moving,
But you see, the glamour lessens when you try to convince somebody to have a movie crew go through your house. And then you have to tell people without stuttering or turning red, you have to tell them we're going to leave your place just the way we found it, which is not necessarily true 99.9% of the time. So locations, people have to convince people to give up their location, but they also have to work hard. They're the first people on set and they're the last people to leave. They have to secure the set, they have to open it up, get people there, and then at the end of the day, they have to clean up and then close the set. So the longest hours are location. And if they're doing that at the same time they're looking for the next location, they're going around the clock.
Well, New Mexico is known for its locations.
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the things that we tried to explain to the legislature when we first went there is, well, everybody's going to come to New Mexico because we have this wonderful environment, this wonderful landscape. And I said, so does every state in the union. I go to Montana, they're going to say, well, look at this. I go to Oregon, look at this. They all got their picturesque spot. And I said, we need something more. We need to basically save them $1. Then they'll come here. But yeah, we do have the picturesque location. That, plus being close to LA, makes it easier than shooting in Vancouver, which is farther away. But we can say, obviously, we are a very beautiful state. I think what we have that other states don't have is a lot of space that isn't industrialized or used, suburban or citywide. We have lots of empty ground, which is why we do the spaceport and everything. But most states are getting populated, filled up. So if you want to shoot a movie where there's lots of space, a sci-fi movie, you come to New Mexico, hopefully you get to Zia Pueblo or someplace where you can shoot acres and acres of unobstructed view. And when they did Lone Ranger, they went down Deming and they scouted down there because there was nothing to see for miles and miles and miles. It was too far from an urban center, so they came here to do the studio work and up by Albuquerque. But yeah, we're probably one of the last states in the U.S. that isn't really overwhelmed with population, doesn't have bad weather, so you can shoot around all, every day of the year.
What else could you ask for?
You could ask for a better incentive like they have in Louisiana, but our legislature doesn't really see giving incentives. Incentives work where we're giving money back to the people who come here on a tax break, but the break-even point's about 17.5%. We have a 25% tax break. Louisiana has 33%. And so when you get that high a tax break, they're always going to go where the money is best, and that means Louisiana right now. Our Georgia, our New York, which is giving away money. So we can't compete with that. But we are close to LA, and we do have a well-trained crew, and that is a benefit there.
Well, we've learned a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot more to learn. But in the meantime, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, Grubb. And we'll take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll be speaking with Rick Clemente. He's the CEO of I-25 Studios in Albuquerque.
Welcome back to New Mexico Media Makers. Our next guest is Rick Clemente, the CEO of I-25 Studios. Thank you for joining us today, Rick.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Please share with us how you got started in the film industry.
The film industry?
Yes.
Well, that was back in the days when the hardest part about filmmaking was putting all those little holes along the edge. I was trained as a still photographer, and one of my early jobs was in TV commercials, doing tabletop setups. In those days, when you shot a TV commercial, they'd bring in a still guy to do the beauty shot of the packaging at the end. One thing led to another. I started shooting TV commercials. I got a call after I was pretty successful at shooting them and directing some of them. A social call from a friend of mine wanted to know, could I run out and do a shot of the sun with a telephoto lens for some cartoon picture that 20th Century Fox was making. And I said, sure. So I went out to this place in the valley where I picked up the camera gear, and it was a Panavision camera with two giant lenses, an 800 and a 1,000 millimeter lens. And the instructions were to go out to the beach and put the sun in a frame up and to the left a little bit and grind off some footage with a 1,000-foot lens, cap it up, back the film up, and double expose in with an 800 millimeter lens bumped over a little bit so you have two suns. So I did that, and I went to dailies the next day, and this little dweeb was there who was the director, and he said, no, there's birds, you can't have birds in the shot. Nobody told me about birds, so I had to do, on my first feature film exercise as a director of photography, I had to go do a reshoot on my first assignment, which was not heartening. It turned out to take 3 tries, because you can't see when you're looking at the sun through a viewfinder. There's no chance of seeing if there are birds or not. I wound up working on that 20th century cartoon picture for over a year, doing miniatures and inserts, and when it came out, it was the first Star Wars movie. And I was the second unit director of photography. And that, when you get a credit like that on a picture that's that successful, then you are a special effects wizard, whether you are or not. And for the next 35 years, I had a career not so much in feature films, but in television commercials, mostly combining live action elements with special visual effects and miniature photography. No, we didn't call it special visual effects back then, it was trick photography, but that's how I misspent a lot of years.
Well, tell us how you're spending these current years.
Well, I was in Los Angeles all my life, and about 5 years ago, my wife and I were sick to death of the traffic and the congestion, and we realized we didn't have many reasons to stay in LA, and we looked around for a place to go, and we came here not for the movie business, but we came here and retired to a nice agricultural scene in Corrales, and one thing led to another because one of our neighbors was Ann Lerner, who's the film commissioner or I don't know, liaison person for the city of Albuquerque. And she found out about my background and said, no, you're not retired. You have to help us with some post-production and this, that, and the other, and one thing led to another, and now I'm the CEO of I-25 Studios. We have 500,000 square feet on 60 acres and a pretty large amount of production capacity. We've done just under $400 million worth of production in that facility since it stopped being the Philips electronics plant and has now matured into a real studio.
Well, so despite the initial frustration and then the retirement, or the faux retirement as we'll call it, you came out here and you got into the business again. So you've seen a whole metamorphosis of the industry. And where do you see it going?
The New Mexico industry is still in its infancy. It's come a huge distance. It is the land of opportunity for especially entry-level people. There's good training at both NMSU and NMU and CNM. They all, and I guess Eastern. There's a bunch of good programs. There's a bunch of good kids coming out. And in my capacity at I-25, when LA producers come to me, they want not just studio space and equipment. They want to know, what have you got in the way of crew? Because if we have it here, they don't have to bring it from there, and it saves them money, and that's the reason they're here in the first place. So an ambitious young person starting out in the business here has an immediate opportunity to get jobs in the business, whereas if somebody was in LA asking me, how do I get in the business, I say, polish up your bartending skills and your waiting skills and make yourself available to work free on student films, and plan on spending 8 or 10 years after you're out of school just getting anywhere where you could begin to call yourself in the business. Here you just jump in.
So how do you see our current standing with the film incentive, and how has I-25 Studios changed with that influx with our film incentive?
Well, the film incentive was originally one of the only ones. It was created in response to the runaway production going to Canada, not state to state. And it was very successful here, and it blossomed here, and other states caught on and started copying it. And now we're to the point where something 40 some odd states have film incentive programs. We still have a couple of advantages. We're an hour and 50 minutes by jet from LA. That's not so important to most of productions, but if you're a casting director in LA and you're casting a TV series where somebody's going to be in the city where it's shot for 8 or 9 months, if that show goes to Baton Rouge or Atlanta or somewhere in South Carolina, the cast is going to be able to, if they live in LA, they're going to be able to get home every other month or something for a weekend. From here, with a little clever Friday afternoon scheduling, they can blow out of here and spend every single weekend at home. And it's a big deal for people with families and whatnot. So it's one of our less touted advantages, but it's really an important one.
Absolutely.
But where might we be lacking as far as the competitive edge? Is there anything that we need to improve on?
Well, people from our side of the business always want to see, you know, if 25% is good, why, 80% is better. So, but it has to be realistic, and it has to be economical. It doesn't have to, quote, pay for itself in tax revenue. I think that's a misgiving that people have, that if the state treasury lays out $1, it ought to collect $1 in taxes. I think it should collect something in taxes that approaches that, and I think it does do that. It's very hard to put a metric to this. But the real purpose of this is economic development, to create jobs and business opportunities for New Mexicans in a cost-effective way. And economic development is not usually looked at as a pay-for-play, dollar-for-dollar enterprise. When you incentivize a building a new community with development bonds and TIDs and all that stuff that I don't really understand, you don't necessarily expect to get it all back. You expect to create a vibrant piece of addition to the economy, and ultimately you do get it back, of course, because when we have a TV series here and we attract an art director from Los Angeles who's a named guy, and they come down here and they work for 8 or 9 months, and they say, well, I'm not going, and there's a viable economic opportunity and industry here, They say, I'm not going back to LA in that traffic. I'm moving here and bringing my kids and family here and buying a house here with a local mortgage and opening a brokerage account and borrowing money from the bank, and you know, that's the payoff. And none of that stuff ever shows up in any of these studies. They look at, you know, how much salary went out and how much was spent on dry cleaning. But the bigger picture is if you build over time, build a vibrant industry, that vibrant industry becomes part of the economic cloth of the community, and these are great jobs. We did a little internal study on In Plain Sight, just a construction gang. They were 100% New Mexicans. They averaged $102,000 in wages. They drove to and from the studio in their diesel pickup trucks. And we figured out the tax they paid to the state in diesel fuel. No one ever figures this in any of these studies. It was about $60,000 in one season, just from the construction crew, just from diesel fuel. So you know, it's kind of, everyone wants to do these studies, but I think it's impossible. I think it's too complicated to do a study.
Well, no. So what we're looking at is a long-term investment.
Yeah, and the longer the payoff is exponential. The longer you stay with it and stay competitive with other states, the deeper those roots sink and the more benefit you get from it every time. When you first start out, you don't have any crew, you give the money away and 80 or 100 people come from out of state and they spend a ton of money, and it makes sense to do that, and then they're gone. The flip side of that is after you're a maturing businesses, and we're getting to that point, you have colleges and universities cranking out people for the industry, and they have jobs here. If you then drop the ball, now taxpayers not only have made the investment by incentivizing the industry to be here, they've also paid a fortune in public funds for the education of the smartest kids in school, and if you drop the ball, you lose all of that. So it's
Well, Rick, we're not going to drop the ball on the future
No,
of the New Mexico film industry, and our industry is so thankful to have your knowledge base and professionalism. Thank you for joining us today on New Mexico Media Makers with our guest Rick Clemente from I-25 Studios and Jim Grubb Graebner of the New Mexico Film Tech Program. We're your hosts, Catharine Pilafas and Mike Gaba. Tune in next week and see what's hot and happening with New Mexico Media. Thank you.